We've reestablished a grain that didn't exist for 70 years. People need to start to reappreciate the role of agriculture in all of our lives. And if it goes away, how devastating that's going to be.
What's the greatest thing you can do? This is the question I found myself asking myself last night before I fell asleep. I don't quite know the answer for myself, but through this story, I hope to find something solid I can hang on to. I want to introduce you to Chad Munger, the co-owner of Mammoth Distilling, a rye-centric distillery that also makes amazing gin in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula in Michigan. You see, he doesn't really want to grow his distillery any more than it already is. Not directly, at least. He sees it more as a piece of a bigger puzzle.
We're in a moment right now where Michigan can become to rye as Kentucky is to bourbon, in terms of grain and in terms of whiskey. And it's the result of a confluence of events, of a supply chain problem that's evolved over the course of the last few years related to COVID, of climate change in Europe and all over the rest of the world, war in Europe, which is the traditional producer of rye for the American spirits industry, and because we've rediscovered the history of rye here in Michigan, which was once the leading producer of rye in North America.
That's a big bite to chew. Big Whiskey, let's call it, gets all their grain from Europe. That means the war in Europe, COVID, climate change, and shipping are all variables that can make it an unstable resource. So by looking back in American history, Chad saw that Michigan was one of the leading growers of rye grain for the whiskey industry. And Chad wants to make that happen again.
You know, Mammoth Distilling was something that we decided to do so we could be a small business, create jobs, create great local products, promote Michigan. That was Mammoth's mission. But there's a limit that it can do what it can do, and Mammoth's relatively mature. But the Rose and Rye story made us realize there's a bigger picture about Michigan agriculture and distilling, and that there's an opportunity for us to do more for the state.
And an important piece of that puzzle is Rose and Rye. So we visited Mammoth Distilling because they, along with Michigan State University, are leading the research on this historically important rye grain varietal. When we got there, we met the head distiller, Colin.
So I'm Colin Goddard. I'm the head distiller of Mammoth Distilling. We're in Central Lake, Michigan right now, just a little north of Traverse City. Come from a 7th generation farming family, so it was a lot of cherries. I loved it, honestly. The area is really cool and really special. My family came here in the late 1870s and started farming. When I left for college, my family farm was kind of in the middle of shutdown mode for the long run. So it was kind of the end of a 7-generation era. And I kind of thought there for a number of years that, there was probably no return to farming for me. And then getting involved with Mammoth Distilling here and starting the Rose and Rye project, luckily enough, I've gotten to have a kind of full-fledged return to it, actually.
Colin showed us stills, and we got to smell the 3rd iteration of their rye whiskey called Rye Number 3. It was like smelling the memories of our yearly week-long family reunions in northern Michigan. Walking over hot pavement covered in cherries that fell off the big trucks moving them from the farms to distribution centers. It smelled of warm sand, clean air, hardy trees, and cold Lake Michigan. It smelled beautiful. But then Colin took us down to their rick house, where their very first barrel of a very special project was sitting, aging, waiting for its debut. But first, you must understand the history of Rose and Rye.
So Rose and Rye is a grain that came to the United States in the pocket of a guy named Joseph Rosen in 1906. He ran into a professor named Dr. Sprague, who was interested in a pocket full of seeds that he had with him. So Sprague took it on himself to propagate this into a crop that was a commercial scale, and then convince farmers in the area that it was worth experimenting with. And eventually, by the 1920s, Michigan was growing actually millions of acres of rose and rye. They discovered along the way, however, that the downside to the variety is that it cross-pollinates quite easily. it eventually lost the characters that were desirable. To solve this problem, Sprague and Michigan State went looking for some farms where the grain could be isolated easily and permanently. And on South Manitou Island, it went wild, essentially. It became a natural seed farm. Those two farms became the seed stock for many of the growers of rye on the east coast of the United States during Prohibition. So effectively, Michigan and South Manitou Island were supplying seed stock for bootleggers during Prohibition. There's a discovery my wife made, actually in Petoskey, just north of here. It is a genuine smuggler's briefcase with the tag from its last train trip between Detroit and Cleveland. Looks like your ordinary businessman's early 20th century briefcase, but when you open it up, it's a pair of flasks, Abercrombie and Fitch silver flasks. Really interesting cork-lined screw top. When bourbon takes over and corn becomes dominant in the whiskey market and rye just generally dies out, Rosen all but disappears. There's a 10-year window or so after Prohibition where some of the biggest players in distilling in the United States, however, were using Rosen rye and using it in bourbon and in rye. And we actually rediscovered the story of Rosen rye through an ad in Vanity Fair magazine, in a 1940s version of Vanity Fair, where they were actually calling the grain out as the preferred grain for distillers making great whiskey. And you just don't see that. You don't see a whiskey label today that has a grain varietal identified in any way, let alone a grain varietal and the place where it was grown.
70 or so years later, and here we are. Chad and the Mammoth team have gained a special license to farm on the island again, grew Rosen rye, and are now making Rosen rye whiskey. Pretty incredible.
And this is all exclusively grown on the island.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was our first test batch here.
Yeah.
So this was like, we had 1,000 pounds left over from what we were trying to reseed this year.
My God.
And so we did, our mashes are 2,000 pounds typically. So it was a half mash, but
that's amazing.
Yeah.
The people who farm it have to camp. Is that right?
Yeah, we do.
You go out, you farm it?
You met the 3 farmers.
No
man.
way,
Yeah.
really? So
Yep.
you guys are out there just camping and growing it?
Mm-hmm. It's pretty wild, man. It's pretty cool. 17-mile trip out to the island by boat. And then, once you're there, it's a remote island in the middle of Lake Michigan. So there's no resources for you whatsoever, really. You're really farming on an island. It's hard, to say the least, and I'm definitely a lifelong outdoorsman, and this is at the pinnacle of kind of what you can kind of handle, at least myself personally. It's a lot, but it's really cool.
You got 3 different varieties. Here's your Rosen rye in this bed right here, compared to Wheeler rye, which goes into our woolly rye. Kind of spicy, actually a cover crop known variety. And then your common rye on the very end there.
Is this sort of experimental? Or
Yeah,
is it,
yeah.
So what are you looking
experimental.
for here?
Oh, just looking at the different types and different sizes, how they perform. I don't know, kind of geeking out a little bit, nerding out on plants. We can tie in farmers to distillers and make a mutually beneficial relationship between the two. That's really what I'm excited to be a part of is the next steps in agriculture,
Meeting all the great people working at Mammoth, I could see they all believed in the mission. They believed in something greater than a whiskey that makes a profit.
Not to say that things like yield and efficiencies aren't important in this industry, but definitely from our mindset, like they are not even close to the most important thing. Like if Rosen didn't yield that well, but it tasted phenomenal and made the best whiskey you've ever had, it's probably worth it.
I feel like we're on the frontier, like we're like
Yeah.
Lewis and Clark of this
You
Rosen
are.
rye.
You're about to travel to the island. It's pretty exciting.
It gets the color fast, doesn't
It
it?
does, yeah. mean, like, honestly, again, it really reminiscent of wheat. I don't get quite the spice load at all that you typically find in rye. I also get a lot of isoamyl acetate, which is kind of like the flavor of banana, actually. So I get a lot of that. Yep.
So how many people have tried this Rosen Rye? How much have you produced so far? And how special is that look right now?
You see,
am I?
dude, you're really lucky right now. Honestly, not a single person outside of this company has tasted, Rosen Rye, let alone Island Rosen Rye. I don't even know. It's, the history is murky on this stuff, but I don't even know if there has ever been whiskey made from pure island grown Rosen Rye. Because the rye that always came off the island was always seed rye because it was genetically pure, and then you could go plant it. Rosen Rye's got a really horrible problem with cross-pollination. It mutates and becomes totally unworth it once it cross-pollinates. So it's got to remain pure. Honestly, this might be the only Island Rosen Rye that's ever, there might be some moonshiners and stuff maybe, but
Oh yeah.
But you see how it's softer than like.
So it's still happening.
Yeah.
Oh, that's crazy. It's just like, it is so much banana.
It does, yeah.
I mean, I'm emotionally connected to it. So it tastes like Lake Michigan to me.
Right?
Yeah.
There you go.
It does. Like, especially like, I mean, I know where South Manitou Island is. I know where, but we grew up going to Fishtown.
Right.
So it's like, to me, it's like, tastes like that pure, and it tastes like
getting Carp River.
Yeah. And getting a sandwich at the cheese shop, and the damn, or not, is it called
damn
the damn candy
store?
store?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
The damn candy store, and just like going to, taking the sandwiches over to that picnicking area, further, and just looking at the boats and walking on the docks. Like, that's what this tastes like. And yeah, thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. This is awesome.
Isn't it fun?
It's so cool.
Yeah. Agriculture in this country and really across the world is in really bad shape. Nothing's been prioritized for flavor in 100 years. Everything's been prioritized for yield. So the incentive is just completely gone. Everyone appears to be farmers in some sense or the other, right? And now it's like you can't find a farmer to save your life. No farms, no food, no whiskey, man. Like, truly, you see it, and it's true. This is all that we could spare this year. Yeah, it is, man. That's lots of years of hard work going into that.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I ask myself, what's the greatest thing you can do? For me, right now, that is this show, Whiskeyland. And there's a bigger picture there too. But it starts with telling these stories. For Colin, it sounds like craftsmanship matters and making the best products he can without being steered by profits. For Chad, it's his gut guiding him. It's his pride in where he came from, his pride in Michigan. The greatest thing he can do today is to plant the tree for the shade he won't see, for the farmers of Michigan, and to the whole agricultural community.
There's a rye-shaped hole in the grain market and in the distilling market in the United States. So rye is still primarily made where you find bourbon made by people that make bourbon. It's an afterthought there. A lot of the smaller brands that do sell rye are reliant on contract distillers out of state that are becoming less engaged in the contract business and more engaged in bottling the things they've been making for years.
Shifting the focus from cheap commodity grain from Europe to premium heritage grain made in Michigan is no easy task. It starts with incentivizing farmers. So we met up with Chad and a farming family in the Saginaw Valley. Recently, the family went from a conventional farm to an organic farm.
I would say the number one reason was economics, because my kids wanted to farm, and land is expensive and it's hard to come by. So we needed a way to generate more income off the same amount of acres.
I actually met the Radichuk family at a conference, the Underground Agricultural Conference in Michigan. I went to that conference pitching the idea that there was a buyer of grain willing and able to include farmers in the value chain beyond just the purchase of grain by the pound.
You know, these guys hopefully will pass it down to their kids. You know, it's got to be there.
They are a family in the Thumb area of Michigan. 7 children, 1,200 acre organic farm that's been in the family for decades, generations, but is proving to be difficult to sustain. And so parents with 7 children that all have some level of interest in remaining in the family business, but don't have much of a chance to do so because the farm just isn't productive enough at the scale that it is right now. What things can we do as purchasers of grain to encourage other growers to want to grow what we want and the way we'd like to see it grown, which is basically what you're describing for us?
Cash is definitely king.
Is it only that? I just don't know.
Right, for the majority, yeah. For us, yeah, definitely. We have to make a living. And I nothing more frustrating when you know you're growing something and the end user's quadrupling what they have invested into it, or maybe more. And we have a huge, and so do they. Everybody has a huge investment, but it's very frustrating.
When they can set their price, but you can't set
Right.
yours.
Can't set our price.
So Consolidated Rye and Whiskey is a second distillery that my wife and I have started. And the focus of that distillery is large-scale contract production of rye whiskey made with Michigan-grown rye. The problem is we're not creating enough demand for novel Michigan-grown products to incentivize growers to grow things they aren't already growing. We're going to make enough whiskey and sell it on a contract basis to get farmers to grow the grains that we're really interested in. Rosen rye is one of those grains.
CRW would grow rosen rye and other varietals at a commercial scale to not only invigorate the agricultural economy in Michigan by becoming the leading growers for the big distilleries in Kentucky, but to empower the growers with single estate distilleries by taking a portion of the grain they grow, distilling it at CRW, and providing those barrels back to the farms to create an agro-tourism market for them to utilize.
We would grow for you guys, and then we could have, like, you would send our barrels back and we'd set them up there. And then we wanted to have like sunflowers, cattle. Kelly has cows. Then we were talking about horses, maybe.
And having people come and taste.
Like whiskey tasting.
Have a tasting room and
A tour.
all of that.
Of the thing or
Yeah.
whatever. So
We have a lot of ideas. Every fall, you know, most people around here go to Johnson's Pumpkin Farm just because that's a tradition, you know. Not really to buy pumpkins mostly. You go there to eat the donuts, go through the maze, the corn maze, and
family time.
yeah, and it's just a time to have, you know, family fun, and it's just a tradition.
We see how these value-added agricultural destinations bring people together, bring the community together, inject it with sort of really interesting energy, and that people connect emotionally, both with the sort of wedding venue part of it, but also with the product part of you. People want to know where their eggs come from, where their food comes from. People want to know where their whiskey comes from.
So if we were to able to start something like that, agritourism, that's a lot of our kids could be part of that if they wanted to.
They immediately grasped the opportunity to add value to their farm by making it an agritourism destination. And, you know, we live in a state and a world where farms are disappearing. They're becoming developments over and over again. The very few families, and most farmers are from families of farmers, that are trying to create a legacy or trying to leave something to their kids who are also interested in agriculture, really struggle. It would be a crime, it would be a shame. We're all going to suffer if farmers disappear. There'll be a reckoning here sooner or later.
In this giant world, all connected by the internet, with all its problems, it can seem like we have no power. We want to stop hunger issues across the world, or save the rainforests, or slow down the melting glaciers. But the solution might be that we need to think smaller, think more locally, a place where you can make change. Someone once said to me, if you want to help people, go outside and look around. Who can you help right in your community? Start there, and you might just see what amazing things you can do. One mystery remained. How did a seed that completely disappeared appear again? How did they make it again? Like, did it exist somewhere?
The USDA has a seed bank. And they have a couple of them. That was in Utah. And it came in a small, plain vanilla envelope, like you put a nickel in. You know, those 18 grams will fit in the palm of your hand. So that's where it started.
So you can't really mess up.
Yeah, this is why Michigan State grew it, not us. Yeah, they grew it out in freezers and fertilized it. They can get a couple growings in because they do it in greenhouses, and they don't. I'm a Michigan guy. I'm from the state of Michigan. And this place has more of a history than I ever had any sense of at all. And it's a much deeper history and more expansive history, more relevant to non-Michigan, to the world that I would have imagined. And to the university, I'm a Spartan. It's an ag school, right? It tied it all back together for me. I grew up in St. John's, which is the mint capital of the world. We have a mint queen and a mint festival. And I pulled the weeds out of muck and shoveled pig manure and did all the things kids do on farms, even though I didn't grow up on them. And it's brought all of those things back into my life in a way that it just feels meaningful. Did he open it? Yeah, they stand on the handles. They're just so long without you.
That's fine. They're up now.
I know. Yeah. It's good stuff, isn't it? If only you could talk.